Well, good evening and welcome to the Kansas City Public Library. I'm Henry Fortunato, Director of Public Affairs. Tonight, I want to open the first 2013 talk in our ongoing Civil War sesquicentennial series with what I suppose many of you might find to be a somewhat mortifying note, to wit, 150 years from now, the odds are that nearly every one of us in this room will be forgotten. But while you're considering this cheery thought, let's look at it on the bright side. At least we won't be remembered for the wrong thing. i.e., our names and our reputations will not be tied to one colossal failure. One incredible disaster that overshadows and blots out the memory of an otherwise reasonably successful career. That, unfortunately, is the fate, or at least the generally accepted narrative, that characterizes the life of Joseph Hooker. Fighting Joe, as he was sometimes called, although there is some evidence that this nom de guerre was really the function of a typographical error. Anyway, before and more significantly after Hooker's brief tenure as commander of the Union's Army of the Potomac, he was known as a solid and effective leader who was also solicitous of his men's welfare. But when it came time for his star turn 150 years ago, when Joseph Hooker faced Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and the Army of Northern Virginia at the Battle of Chancellorsville in the spring of 1863, he suffered a devastating defeat. Indeed, the flip side of this loss that was inflicted on Hooker and the Union arms is that it is also known as Lee's perfect battle. So tonight we're going to learn more about that battle and the star-crossed destiny that gave Joe Hooker his most enduring historical memory. Our guide is Dr. Ethan Rafuse of the Military History Department of the U.S. Army's Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. Over the past few years, Ethan has become one of our most popular presenters, on top of which he serves as the chief point person at Fort Leavenworth for our Civil War sesquicentennial series, which, good news, still has more than 2 years to go. We hope to welcome him back repeatedly for quite some time. Ethan earned his BA and his MA degrees in history at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, and his PhD in history and political science right here at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. He began his professional career in public history as a park ranger at the Manassas National Battlefield, also at the Harry S. Truman National Historic Site. In 2001 through 2003, he taught military history at the United States Military Academy at West Point, but since 2004, he's been a professor of military history at the Command and General Staff College. In 2012-2013, he was scholar-in-residence at the George Tyler Moore Center for the Study of the Civil War. He's lectured at the Carlisle Barracks, the Naval War College, and he also delivered the inaugural lecture in the Department of Defense's History Speakers Series. Ethan has published over 250 articles, essays, reviews, and is the author, editor, or co-editor of 9 books, including McClellan's War, The Failure of Moderation and the Struggle for the Union, Robert E. Lee and the Fall of the Confederacy, 1863-65, and the forthcoming Army War College Guide to Richmond and Petersburg Campaigns, 1864-65. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Ethan Rafuse.
Boring for a guy like Fighting Joe Hooker. This should be an interesting. I do a Civil War blog, and I promote my upcoming lectures. Last year, I gave a lecture at the National Archives in connection with their series on Missouri at War, and my lecture was on the Battle of Lexington, which was famously known as the Battle of the Hemp Bales, because hemp bales were used by the Confederates as sort of movable breastworks. And in my blog, when I posted about this, I put the headline, "Hemp, thinking that that might enable us to get an audience that's skewed a bit younger demographically. Of course, you know, if I just blogged about this hooker, I don't know what kind of audience I'd be getting tonight. Although the legend, the name Hooker had been around before Fighting Joe came to prominence in the 1840s, so it's not true that hookers were named after him, although there are some interesting connections that will come up in the course of this discussion. Okay, the basic thing, we're starting 1863. Last year we did 1862. We ended with our round table on the Battle of Antietam. George McClellan had just defeated Robert E. Lee. Lee had retreated back into Virginia. McClellan's army crossed into Virginia in late October, early November, but too slow to suit the taste of Abraham Lincoln. McClellan was relieved from command. Ambrose Burnside replaced him, and this led ultimately to the Battle of Fredericksburg, where Joe Hooker plays a prominent role. It's a federal defeat, and this leads to Hooker's ascendance to command this week, 150 years ago, the last week of January, 1863. Now, 1863 starts off the context in which we're talking about here, the general Union strategy. There's been a fundamental change in it over the last 12 months. At the beginning of 1862, the basic concepts that Union strategy, that drove Union strategy, was based on one, military. And that was the belief that you could win the war quickly if you concentrated your efforts in Virginia, made Virginia the first priority. Defeat the Confederate Army in Virginia, capture their capital, and that should lead to a collapse of Confederate resistance. Complementary to this, to accelerate the collapse of Confederate resistance, under McClellan, the North was pursuing something called a strategy of conciliation, which was the idea is you want to make Southern resistance futile, and you demonstrate that militarily by capturing their capital, defeating their army, but you also want to make resistance pointless. To say to Southerners, you have no reason to fight because the North is not a threat to your institutions. The whole Confederate war effort is based on, the Confederacy is based on an idea, you need an independent Confederacy to protect the institution of slavery. And McClellan believes by making clear the North is not attacking slavery, you will undermine that pillar of support for the Confederacy. And the idea is this would produce a quick victory in the war. Well, in the middle of 1862, with setbacks in the 7 days, heavy casualties, Lincoln moves to a much tougher policy. The Congress passes the Second Confiscation Act, which allows confiscation of Southern property. John Pope, a general, issues very stringent orders targeting civilians. And then finally, Lincoln decides he's going to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. He waits until after the victory at Antietam to issue it. But this has changed the war fundamentally, in that there's no longer the assumption that you can make Southern resistance collapse quickly. It's going to be a long war. Consequently, what happens is operations in the West take on a higher priority. Henry Halleck, the man up here, is the general-in-chief, and Henry Halleck has believed since the beginning of the war that the Mississippi River is worth 40 Richmonds. And so consequently, the North is going to make more of a priority in the West, because the belief is, well, we've got to conquer the whole Confederacy anyway, and also in the West, because of the way the rivers and logistical network is, it'll make it a bit easier for us to achieve military victories, and then therefore we can gain territory, sustain Northern popular support, and gradually exhaust the Confederacy in combination with the strategy of attacking slavery, which will weaken the Confederate war effort by taking away that source of labor. So on the one hand, they've adopted the policy of harder war, the Emancipation Proclamation, conscription, the North has adopted conscription, and used African American troops. Second, this headquarters doctrine. The basic assumption is we can't win the war quickly. Decisive victory in the battlefield is not going to end the war. So we've got to direct the South's will and ability to make war by targeting its civilian economy as well. Consequently, there's a Western emphasis, target logistical targets, territorial targets out there. And in the East, McClellan had tried to advance on Richmond from the east. Lincoln had never liked that for reasons I will quickly just demonstrate quickly, right here. Union lines of operation in Virginia. Baron Antoine Jomini says the first principle of a good campaign plan is understanding your lines of operations. In Virginia, the Virginia Theater, where Hooker, McClellan, Burnside, other federal commanders in the East are going to have to operate. This is the basic logistics network. Because of the size of Civil War armies, it is necessary to have either a railroad or a river to supply them logistically. The Prussian army does studies around this time, and they come to the calculation that the largest force that can be supported simply using wagons and muscle power, animal muscle power, is 30,000 men. Because in order for the animals to pull the supplies, you've got to have food in the wagons for the animals, and you reach a certain point where the animals are pulling only the food in their own wagons and don't have room for anything else. So they calculate about 30,000 men is the most you can supply using a road. But using a river and using railroads, you can supply a much larger force. And these armies in the East are going to number 100,000 men, 70,000 men, and up. So consequently, you need to use a railroad. Now, the first obvious line of operation if you're leaving Washington is to take what's called the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. Starts near Washington, D.C., and heads out south and west. This was what we used in the first Manassas campaign. Again, Manassas is an important point on this railroad. And it is, to a certain, it makes sense. You're going to march out of Washington, take this railroad. But there's a basic problem with this railroad. It runs off to the south and the west, and ultimately leads you away from Richmond. Also, there is this problem of railroads, and that is a railroad line of supply is very, very vulnerable. How many people does it take to wreck a railroad supply line? One, which means one guy if he's got a match, okay? So, every mile you go south, you're going to have to leave forces behind to protect your railroad. This is a process that's called strategic consumption. An army on the offensive is never stronger than when it begins the offensive, because as it moves forward, it's got to protect its supply line. This is called a process of strategic consumption. And you see, the further south you get, the more railroads you've got to protect. And there's a point at which you reach, sort of like with the horses and the animals, you reach a certain point where you got so many guys protecting the railroad that you're not going to have many bayonets in the front line. And you reach about that point when you get around Culpeper, and if you get out to Gordonsville, you're probably too far out to have much strength left after you've left behind forces to protect. Now, Abraham Lincoln likes this line of operations because it guarantees essentially that Washington is going to be protected. Your main army is protecting Washington from the Confederates. Now, once you reach this point, you've got a couple options. If you can get down to Gordonsville, perhaps you can cut over on the Virginia Central Railroad, or perhaps you can cut over to Fredericksburg, where you will find another railroad, which is going to offer the second line of operations, the Acquia to Fredericksburg route. Now, after Antietam, which takes place around Hagerstown up there, McClellan's army is going to cross the Potomac River and move toward and reach the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. When they reach the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, McClellan is relieved from command. Ambrose Burnside takes command and makes the decision, I want to move to Fredericksburg and use this line of operations. Burnside quickly moves, but there are problems, and that leads to the big problems at Fredericksburg. But the basic advantage here is, for the first part of your logistical line, you've got rivers, which are good for the Union because essentially you don't got to leave guys behind to protect them, because the northern naval superiority essentially provides a secure route using these rivers. And then once you reach Fredericksburg, then you've got a railroad that leads directly towards Richmond. Problems here, of course, once you start moving south, you get the problem of strategic consumption going back to Fredericksburg, protecting your supply line. Second problem is you've got to cross rivers, which provide natural supply defensive positions for the Confederates when you are on the offensive heading towards Richmond. These problems are what lead George McClellan to not like either of these routes and advocate instead taking the Army of the Potomac down to the lower Chesapeake Bay. And then the basic idea is you can use one of a couple rivers, make the rivers work for you instead of against you, and then move up on Richmond from this position with secure logistics provided by the Navy. And indeed, 1862, it's a bit of an exaggeration, but not too much, to say the contrast between northern success in the west versus northern problems in the east is the simple matter of geography. Out west, the rivers work with the south, with the north, because Grant can move up the Cumberland, up the Tennessee, up the Mississippi, or down the Mississippi, and have that secure line of supply. Well, in Virginia, you've got the problem of the overland approach. Now, McClellan advocates this concept here. It's going to inspire his Peninsula campaign. Abraham Lincoln hates this idea. The reason he hates this idea is the question of, while our army's away, who is protecting Washington? Or who is protecting the Shenandoah Valley out there? McClellan's answer to this is twofold. One, if the main Union army is in front of Richmond, the Confederates are not going to be operating against Washington. Second, he builds a system of fortifications around Washington, D.C. that essentially provides an economy of force measure to enable his maneuver force to go down to the peninsula. Now, what happens in the Shenandoah Valley campaign, where northern armies have problems, the fact that the Peninsula campaign does not result in the capture of Richmond leads Lincoln to believe that he was right all along. And of course, once he recalls the army back after the Peninsula campaign, probably the biggest decision Lincoln makes in 1862 over what everybody knows to be the objections to George McClellan. He kind of can't concede that McClellan might have been right and let the army go back to the peninsula. But for Army of the Potomac officers, many of whom enjoyed the patronage of George McClellan and shared his operational ideas, they believe the Peninsula campaign was undermined because Lincoln did not get the basic concept here, and that he panicked during the Shenandoah Valley campaign. To Lincoln and the Republicans, the problem was this approach was flawed all along. And this basic division is going to do a lot to create a problem for command in the Army of the Potomac. Any questions about this up here? All right. Fighting Joe Hooker. As mentioned, he comes into command. Born in 1837 in Massachusetts, born 1817 in Massachusetts, graduated from the United States Military Academy in 1837. One of his classmates was Braxton Bragg. Finished about the middle of the class, was commissioned into the artillery, and has a pretty decent record. In the Mexican War, however, he is going to take some actions that are going to do much to derail his military career. During the Mexican War, the commander of the United States Army was Winfield Scott, who was a Whig. The President of the United States was a Democrat who did not want Whig heroes, did not trust Whig generals. So he made sure that all of Winfield Scott's subordinates were good Democratic politicians. In essence, the job of the division commanders was not so much to support Winfield Scott as it was to keep an eye on Winfield Scott. And what happens after the successful campaign in Mexico City, one of those division commanders issues a proclamation talking about how awesome his performance was. And Winfield Scott decides to court-martial him for issuing this order without going through proper channels. This man's name was Gideon Pillow. One of Pillow's staff officers was Joe Hooker. And when they had the court-martial and testimony was taken, Winfield Scott versus Pillow, Joe Hooker testified on behalf of Gideon Pillow, which is not good for your future because Winfield Scott is the hero of the West Point educated officers whom he has patronized and brought into his inner circle. So that pretty much brings an end to Joe Hooker's hopes for further promotion in the United States Army. He leaves, he goes into California, goes into business, doesn't do very well. Many of his associates will say this will be the time he goes to the dogs, he drinks, he loses money, and one of the stories is to get a loan at a bank. One of the big bankers out there was Henry Halleck at the time. Hooker borrowed money from Halleck, never paid it back, and this is going to have an effect on command relationships when Halleck is General-in-Chief and Hooker is commander of the Army of the Potomac. Now, when the war begins, 1861, Hooker makes his way from California to Washington. He doesn't get a command early, but after the Battle of First Bull Run, he goes to the president and says, I don't know much, but I know I'm a better officer than anybody you saw out on the field out there today. Lincoln likes Joseph Hooker. He's an aggressive, hard-fighting, charismatic guy. And so Lincoln gives him command of a division. And he takes command of this division and is going to serve with it on the Peninsula campaign and the Second Manassas campaign. Now this division becomes notorious. Here you got a map up here that was published in a Washington newspaper in 1880s. There's a section of Washington, D.C. that is called Hooker's Division. Okay? It's where Hooker's guys camped, their division camped during the early part of the war. Now, this map up here, here's Pennsylvania Avenue, just where it is in Washington, D.C. today. Here is Pennsylvania Avenue. Ohio Avenue does not exist anymore. Constitution Avenue is right down here, okay? So you're looking essentially, the Treasury Department's over here, Pennsylvania Avenue right here. Now, Hooker's division becomes notorious. I found this from an 1880 newspaper. And it was reported by the 1880s. This section of Washington, D.C. Was called by a newspaper known as Hooker's Division, occupied by the camp of General Joe Hooker's troops in the defense of Washington. Since then, it has become the plague spot of Washington, a center of vice, liquor selling, and prostitution. The 4 daily newspapers of the city are published within that territory. How much coincidence? Man, not. And within its borders are the leading banks. Within this district alone, there are over 150 bawdy houses or saloons in this area by the 1880s. At the time, it was because it mentions President Grover Cleveland. And of course, Grover Cleveland had an illegitimate child, so spin that a little bit. But over 100, but the really what outraged the writers of this note here was not so much that these bawdy houses and saloons were working, but that they were operating having not paid the $400 license that they needed to pay in order to sell liquor in Washington, D.C. That was the real outrage, not what was going on there. But if you want to know what it is today, if you go to Washington, D.C., Constitution Avenue runs right by the mall, separates the Ellipse in Washington, D.C., and the White House from the Washington Monument. Now, at the time of the Civil War, Constitution Avenue was actually a canal. It was called Tiber Canal, Washington Canal at the time. Now, when they built Constitution Avenue, they essentially shoved Constitution Avenue on top of this swampy, marshy land. And consequently, the government buildings along here, they've got wooden piers underneath to stabilize them. And one of those buildings is the IRS building, which has wooden piers on it. And a decade or so ago, when they were building the Ronald Reagan building, they encountered this marshy soil underneath. So consequently, they did some work with it, and it diverted some of the water, but that undermined some of the wooden piers of the IRS building. And someone's curious, the Ronald Reagan building is undermining the foundation for the IRS. And again, the Reagan building is right about here. The IRS is right. The Department of Commerce is nearby as well. So, interesting Washingtonian. But Hooker's division becomes notorious. Hookers are not named after Joe Hooker, but his division gets quite the reputation. Organizes the division, leads it well in the Peninsula campaign, and in the Antietam campaign, he's elevated to corps commander, performs well at the Battle of Antietam before he's shot through the foot and wounded. And after being wounded, he heads to Washington, D.C., and tells anybody who would listen how much better of an officer he would be in command of the Army than either George McClellan, Ambrose Burnside, or anybody else. And he makes very close relationship with Republicans in Congress and the Lincoln administration, who are very, very hostile to the Army of the Potomac High Command led by McClellan. Now, Hooker is recovering from his wound, and Burnside is placed in command of the Army while that's happening. Burnside reorganizes the Army into 3 grand divisions. The commanders will be Edwin Sumner, William B. Franklin, and Joseph Hooker. And these 3 divisions, grand divisions of 2 corps each, fight the Battle of Fredericksburg. Now, the Battle of Fredericksburg, so many of you studied the battle, the futile attacks on the sunken road at Marie's Heights, division after division, sent up to attack by Ambrose Burnside. And then finally, one last division is supposed to be thrown into the assault, and the Grand Division commander stops the assault. And later says, I felt I had lost as many men as my orders required me to lose. And that was Joe Hooker. And Hooker before the battle, he questioned the wisdom of Burnside's plan. During the battle, he criticized the conduct of Burnside's conduct of operations. And after the battle, when he started investigating, he criticized Burnside even more. To the point that when that Burnside gets to the point where he issues an order, General Order number 8 on the 23rd of January, 1863, that states, quote, General Joseph Hooker, having been guilty of unjust and unnecessary criticisms of the actions of his superior officers and of the authorities, and having, by the general tone of his conversation, endeavored to create distrust in the minds of officers who have associated with him, made reports and statements that were calculated to create incorrect impressions, and for habitually speaking in the disparaging terms of other officers, is hereby dismissed from the service of the United States as a man unfit to hold an important commission. Burnside drafts this, and then he takes the advice of one of his subordinates, says, run this by Lincoln first. It gets sent up to Lincoln. Lincoln receives this. And Burnside is coming under incredible criticism. Hooker is not the only subordinate in the Army who is complaining about Burnside's performance. And Lincoln's got a decision to make. Burnside says, here's the order. Fire me, kick me out of the Army, or stand by my order. Lincoln decides not to kick Burnside out of the Army, but decides to change the command of the Army of the Potomac. And he gives command of that army to Joseph Hooker a few days later. Now, of course, the question is, what kind of command climate is being created here in this Army of the Potomac? Lincoln addresses this famously in a letter to Hooker upon his taking command, written on the 26th of January, 1863. I've placed you at the head of the Army. This is a very famous letter that Lincoln writes. I've placed you at the head of the Army of the Potomac. I've done this for what appears to be sufficient reasons. And yet, I think it best for you to know there's some things in regard to which I am not quite satisfied with you. I believe you to be a brave soldier, you have confidence in yourself, and he says, quote, you're ambitious, which within reasonable bounds does good rather than harm. But I think that during General Burnside's command of the Army, you have taken counsel of your ambition and thwarted him as much as you could, in which you did a great wrong to the country and to a most meritorious and honorable brother officer. Again, this is a person Lincoln is giving a promotion to, okay? Also the famous line, I've heard it said, you said in such a way, that you said the Army and the government need a dictator. Of course, it was not for this, but in spite of this that I've given you the command. Only those generals who gain successes can set up dictators. What I now ask of you is military success, and I will risk the dictatorship. The government will support you. Line, I fear much that the spirit which you have aided to infuse into the Army of criticizing their commander and withholding confidence from him will now turn upon you. Okay. Now, the spirit with which you have infused into the Army. Let's look at this problem in the Army of the Potomac. Where does the spirit come from of quarrelness and division and divisiveness within the Army of the Potomac? It goes back to its birth. At the time when George McClellan becomes commander of the Army of the Potomac, the General-in-Chief is Winfield Scott. George McClellan undermines Scott whenever he gets a chance. In part because you know who encourages him to do it? By going to his headquarters and talking directly to him, bypassing Scott? President Abraham Lincoln. Even after Winfield Scott gets the Secretary of War to issue orders saying all communication must come through the General-in-Chief, what does Lincoln keep doing? Going directly to McClellan. And McClellan goes to members of Congress and say, Winfield Scott's in the way. Is the chain of command sustained by President Lincoln? No. What happens in November 1861? Winfield Scott is relieved as General-in-Chief, and who takes the position? George McClellan. Message sent. If you undermine your commanding officer, will there be punishment? You may get an order, may get a letter saying don't do it, but actions speak louder than words, do they not? And then, when McClellan comes to the question of how do I organize my army into corps, McClellan's reluctant to do it for a while, because the senior officers, the senior division commanders in the Army of the Potomac are men older than him, who resent having to serve under him, who disagree with him on many views. So McClellan is reluctant to organize corps, and their disagreement becomes evident when McClellan presents his idea for going low at Chesapeake Bay in his operations. Lincoln forces him to put it to a vote of the division commanders. And the vote is 8-4 in favor of McClellan's plan. But 3 of the 4 voting against it are the senior division commanders. And that very same day, Abraham Lincoln issues an order organizing the corps. And who does he directly appoint as the corps commanders? The same people who oppose McClellan's plan. Message: if you're a corps commander in this army, is it your job to salute and do whatever you're told by the army commander? Or is it your job, much like the division commanders in the Mexican War was, to watch over, check over, and provide a way for Washington to look over, to check and control and keep control over these commanding officers? And again, this spirit pops up over and over and over again. And this is just the latest episode where instead of defending the chain of command, what has Lincoln done in the case of Hooker and Burnside? He's essentially saying there's a spirit infused in this army. Who is responsible for the spirit that's in this army? Now this is good for Lincoln, right? Lincoln wants to have all kinds of voices, hear all kinds of voices, get everybody's input. An open door policy is a good thing, right? Unless it's an organization like this where you have to have a chain of command where people follow their orders in this army, you can't give orders without worrying about the guy you're giving them to who's going to undermine you. Consequently, you can't take orders in this army without being concerned that, and of course you've got patrons on both sides of the political aisle trying to manipulate people in this army for their own political purposes. It creates an incredibly toxic situation in this army. And Hooker is going to have to take command of this army and deal with that. And this is the team he gets. First Corps commander up here, John Reynolds, a professional officer, but also viewed as a McClellanite, former commandant of cadets at West Point. He came into the Army as a brigadier general at the big patronage from George B. McClellan. He's a West Pointer. Darius Couch, the 2nd Corps commander here, class of 1846 at West Point, same class as George McClellan, another McClellan sympathizer. We'll skip this guy for a second, but we got this guy, George Meade, a West Pointer, an engineer, who in his letters to his wife is going to complain about the overland route, is going to advocate going back to the James as what he calls the only true and practicable line of operations in Virginia. So clearly he is much closer to the McClellan camp than the Lincoln camp. John Sedgwick, commanding the 6th Corps, West Point graduate, widely viewed as very much a McClellan man. Oliver Otis Howard, well, he's new to Corps Command. He's young, he's 33, but he's not going to have a very good relationship with Hooker. Hooker had a reputation for drinking, had a reputation for, one person said his headquarters was a combination barroom and brothel. Oliver Otis Howard is a very, very, very pious religious individual, which means he's not going to be a big fan of Joe Hooker and his personal habits. Now, Howard's got an additional problem. His command is the 11th Corps, which is made up of German immigrants. And when he tries to stamp out drinking and stuff like that in a corps of German immigrants, he's going to have some problems with them. Henry Slocum, also a West Point man, also perceived to be a pro-McClellan man. And finally, George Stoneman, the commander of the cavalry, he rose up while McClellan was in command of the army. So, of these corps commanders, does Joe Hooker have reason to be concerned about the spirit in his army and cooperation? Now, the final guy, Dan Sickles. Oh no, some people have been studying Gettysburg. Or at least they haven't been reading Dan Sickles' own writings. Okay. Dan Sickles, not a West Pointer. Dan Sickles is a political general. Okay. He is from New York. He's from the Tammany Hall. So, well, you know, don't worry about piety and stuff like that from Dan Sickles. And of course, the story about Dan Sickles is he's already famous, but not for being a commander. He's famous because as a congressman, he shot his wife's lover right across the street from the White House. That it was famous because the lover was the son of Francis Scott Key, the author of the Star-Spangled Banner. Now, what was going on is Sickles was a congressman, and, you know, he had all kinds of mistresses and all kinds of dalliances and all kinds of acts of questionable character. But that was okay because, you know, he was a congressman. But his wife fooled around once, and he shot her lover to death. There is a trial, and in this case, Dan Sickles, which is going to be lucky for him in 1857, lucky for him in 1863, he finds a lawyer by the name of Edwin Stanton, who just so happens to be the Secretary of War in 1863 and hates with a passion George Brinton McClellan. Okay? Sickles is good in 1857 because he comes up with the idea of temporary insanity defense. And Sickles gets off. And then he does Washington society is then more scandalized than by anything else, because Sickles forgives his wife and takes her back. That scoundrel. Okay, so that's Dan Sickles. Now, he is going to be a welcome character in Joe Hooker. He started out as brigade commander in Hooker's command. Initially, Hooker was somewhat skeptical of him and Hooker's division, but eventually the two of them get together very well because they both agree that they don't like George McClellan and the McClellanites, and so they get along very, very well. But he's the only one of his corps commanders that Hooker feels he can completely and totally trust. Okay? And Dan Sickles has got some other issues. Of course, the Battle of Gettysburg, we'll talk a little bit about the Battle of Gettysburg if we get the time. All right, so this is the command team he gets. This is the challenge of command that Hooker faces. The operational challenge, and he faces the command challenge. Now, once again, after the Battle of Fredericksburg, the Army retreats back across the Rappahannock River, and Hooker's got to come up with a plan to try to deal with Lee's army. One of the things he does as an organizer is he is going to combine the cavalry units. He's going to really reinvigorate the Union cavalry. And this is going to be evident in March of 1863 in an operation at the battle of, what becomes known as the Battle of Kelly's Ford. Up until this time, Confederate cavalry has been riding rings around the Union Army cavalry. Okay? And what Hooker has done by trying to organize them into a single corps and instill a little more fighting spirit in them to try to match Robbie Lee, Jeb Stuart's cavalry guys with, try to meet them on even terms. Now what happens at Kelly's Ford is part of a story of two old West Point classmates. Fitz Lee on the Confederate side, William Averill on the Federal side. There was an engagement in which the two sides fought, and the Confederates under Lee defeated Averill's guys, Averill's Confederates. Afterwards, Fitz Lee sent a jaunty little telegram to his friend Averill saying, you know, if you guys are going to come over and bother us and get beaten again, you might as well leave some coffee for us as well. After Averill is going to lead a cavalry force across at Kelly's Ford. They're going to fight a sharp engagement with Fitz Lee's command, drive them back, and it's really one of the first battles in which the Union cavalry really gets the upper hand on the Confederates. Afterwards, Averill leaves behind a note. Hi, Fitz. Here's the coffee. How'd you enjoy this visit? So you get that victory at Kelly's Ford. And then finally, in late April, Hooker is going to launch what becomes the Chancellorsville campaign, an effort to try to maneuver around Lee's army. Now, Hooker has worked wonders with the Army of the Potomac. When he took over command after Fredericksburg, it was in a huge depressed state of morale. Desertions were just crazy all over the place because the men weren't getting fed, they weren't getting paid, and Hooker proves himself to be a very, very adept and effective administrator. He, in cooperation with Lincoln, gets a general amnesty for deserters, and the deserters return. They also develop a method for identifying deserters, and this is going to be the badge system. Basically, Hooker is going to give each of the corps a specific badge, a circle for one corps, a lozenge for another, a diamond for another, a trefoil for another. And essentially, there are going to be 3 divisions in each corps. The first division will have a white badge, the second a red badge, the third division a blue badge. Now, these are intended to help deal and find deserters and try to identify deserters and what units they belong to. But these badges actually become a powerful, potent tool for morale because the corps and divisions take great pride in their badges. And this is going to play a big role in Hooker's reinvigorating his army. In addition, Hooker's division, he grants liberal furloughs to soldiers to go back to Washington, D.C., and they round up the prostitutes, and they put them in Hooker's division so that when troops go back to Washington, 1, they can easily find what they're looking for, but 2, also, so the provost marshal and the medical services department can monitor the area in order to make sure the soldiers, when they go into Hooker's division in D.C., don't come out in worse shape than they, in certain ways, than they went into it. And these efforts, the morale of the Army of the Potomac is high, but then at the Battle of Chancellorsville, Hooker crosses the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers. He fights Lee's army. He inflicts tremendous casualties on Lee's army, but eventually has to retreat back across the Rappahannock River in what is, Henry says, often viewed as Lee's greatest victory and an embarrassing defeat for Hooker. Now, Hooker is going to blame his setbacks in part on being undermined by Army of the Potomac Corps commanders. Lincoln comes down for a visit. Those Army of the Potomac Corps commanders let it be known to the president that they would really have someone other than Joseph Hooker in command of the army. Okay? All except Dan Sickles, who still stands by his man. Okay? But Lincoln initially says, you know, I'm not going to throw away a tool just because it misfires the first time. He keeps Hooker in command. In the aftermath of Chancellorsville, Robert E. Lee gets authority to move north in what's become the Gettysburg campaign. This leads to engagements at Brandy Station, the large cavalry battle. And as the 2 armies move north, there's engagements in the Loudoun Valley, at Winchester. And on June the 25th, Hooker learns that Lee's army has crossed the Potomac River, and he orders his army across, moving into Maryland. Now, a big bone of contention becomes the Harper's Ferry garrison. Hooker wants Union forces to leave Harper's Ferry and join his army. Henry Halleck wants those forces kept in Harper's Ferry. Hooker goes over to Harper's Ferry and talks to the commander, William B. French, and lets him be known he wants his force to join the Army of the Potomac and be under his command. While Hooker is meeting with French, French sends a letter to Halleck asking about this arrangement, and Halleck sends orders to French that explicitly say, pay no attention to any order given to you by Joe Hooker. Hooker sends a message to Washington and says, basically, take this job and shove it. I resign command. He thinks that Washington is going to back down, but Washington accepts his resignation. And they choose a corps commander to take command, a man by the name of George Gordon Meade. Now, what happens is Meade's corps is in camp around Frederick when a messenger from Washington shows up by the name of James Hardy and knocks on Meade's tent in the middle of the night. And Meade thinks, this isn't good. This isn't good. I must be under arrest or something. Because, I mean, he and the division, Hooker knows that the other corps commanders have been sort of rallying around Meade and telling Lincoln that they'd like to be commanded by Meade instead of Hooker. And Meade is thinking, uh-oh, I'm under arrest for something. Turns out to be much, much worse news. He's been placed in command of the Army of the Potomac. And Meade's famous saying is, well, I've been tried without a hearing, I might as well go get shot. He goes to Hooker, informs Hooker of the news. Hooker is surprised, but goes off peacefully and turns over command to George Meade, and Hooker heads back to Washington to make sure that his version of events gets to his friends in Washington. And here we have George Meade, 1835 West Point graduate, engineer, got out of the Army for a little bit, right into an economic recession, got political strings pulled, got back into the Army. Born in Cadiz, Spain, marries into the Sargent family of Philadelphia, a very prominent Whig family in Philadelphia, and has a pretty good career in the antebellum Army. He particularly does good work on the Lighthouse Survey. But he's not, not a very colorful person, but he's the kind of commander that George McClellan likes and brings into the Army of the Potomac because he's an engineer, a West Pointer, and tends to see things in engineering terms as opposed to like Joe Hooker. Meade has had a steady career. He performed effectively in the 7 Days battles, got shot. He performed effectively the Battle of Antietam. And at Fredericksburg, his forces achieved the only real break penetration of the Confederate lines. He's highly regarded, highly thought of by everybody except for Hooker and Sickles. And he is given command of the Army of the Potomac on the eve of the Great Battle. Now, what Meade does immediately is he tries to rectify an organizational problem that Hooker had created. The problem Hooker created was that he had broken up the Grand Division organization that Burnside had. Now, there's generally a military concept that's generally not good to have more than 3 maneuver elements under your command, because then it becomes too complicated and too difficult to manage. Well, that's sort of what the Union armed forces have been moving organizationally to that concept. McClellan, during the Maryland campaign, organizes his corps into 3 wings. Burnside follows that with the 3 divisions. What Hooker does, he breaks up the Grand Divisions, and he tries to command by corps. And Battle of Chancellorsville is very confusing to study because it is all broken up and moving all over the place. If it's confusing to study now, how hard to keep track of it. What Meade does when he takes command is he once again tries to bring these forces into, combine them into larger elements. He has 3 of his corps, the 11th Corps under Howard, 3rd Corps under Sickles, and 1st Corps under John Reynolds, combined into the left wing of the Army with Reynolds as the overall commander. The 3 Corps, Winfield Scott Hancock's 2nd Corps, George Sykes' 5th Corps, and Henry Slocum's 12th Corps will be combined into a center wing under Slocum's overall command. On the right, the 6th Corps, which is by far the biggest corps, is large enough to be its own wing. That's going to be commanded by John Sedgwick. And it's in this sort of organization, and you got the cavalry under Pleasanton. The cavalry corps is broken up. Each of the wings is going to have a cavalry division out scouting in front of us, and scouting out in front of this wing is going to be Gettysburg, moving. Buford, okay? The connections to Hollywood, okay? And it's moving up in this sort of organization that it makes contact with the Confederates at Gettysburg, and which the Battle of Gettysburg is going to be fought on the 1st of July through the 3rd of July, 1863. And again, Meade takes command in Frederick. He's got Reynolds' forces up moving here. He's got Slocum's wing here, and he's got Sedgwick's wing out over here. And it's the left wing that comes into contact with the Confederates, who, when Meade takes command, have reached the banks of the Susquehanna, are threatening Harrisburg, and are threatening to burn the big railroad bridge at Wrightsville. And they do burn the bridge. Once Meade's forces are moving north, this is when Lee gets the information and finds out, not from Jeb Stuart, from a scout, that Meade's army is north of Potomac. that is when Lee begins concentrating his army in the direction of Gettysburg, and this sets up the clash, the Battle of Gettysburg on the 1st and 3rd of July. Meade wins the battle, but of course you get huge controversy coming out of this battle, in part due to the efforts of Daniel Sickles, okay? And after the battle, of course, during the battle, Dan Sickles is going to get wounded, and like Joe Hooker after Antietam the previous year, as soon as he gets his first aid treatment, he makes his next stop Washington, D.C., so he can make sure that Washington gets his account of story what happened, as opposed to George Meade's when it comes through. Now, Dan Sickles is also the only Union Corps commander who does not have a statue at Gettysburg. Now, the story is that the Excelsior Brigade, which was his original unit, was going to have a wonderful monument, and they have one over near the Peach Orchard, and that there's going to be a bust of Dan Sickles on there. But they ran out of money, and coincidentally, Dan Sickles was in charge of the financing and the money for that thing, and so something happened. But Dan Sickles, after the battle, he is going to claim that George Meade, like a McClellanite, wanted to retreat from Gettysburg. And only his bold leadership in disobeying Meade's orders is what prevented Meade from retreating and enabled the North to win the Battle of Gettysburg. So Dan Sickles views himself, so after the war, when someone asks Dan Sickles, where's your monument on the battlefield if you were so important? He will later say, this whole battlefield is my monument. And plays a significant role in his preservation. Now, according to Dan Sickles' logic, his performance at Gettysburg saved the Union Army and therefore saved the Union, right? But that's not the end of Dan Sickles' story. After the war, Dan Sickles is going to be appointed ambassador to Spain. And his reputation precedes him. And his conduct creates rumors and reports that the Queen of Spain now has a Yankee King of Spain. And it is concern about who is ruling Spain that leads Prussia and France in 1870 to go to war, out of which comes a unified Germany. And continued instability in the Spanish, of course, in the Spanish Empire, is going to lead to our war with Spain, which leads us to get in the Philippines. And of course, a unified Germany is the spark for World War I and World War II. And our acquisition of the Philippines is going to be a spark for World War II in the Pacific. Dan Sickles is the father of the modern world. Okay, so he wins the Battle of Gettysburg. Lee's army begins retreating back towards the Potomac River. There's heavy rains, and that swells the Potomac. Lee eventually takes up a position at Williamsport, a very strong defensive position on a place called Salisbury Ridge. Meade declines to attack it before Lee can get away, and Lincoln loses faith with Meade at that point on and is never going to trust Meade really again. However, the problem for Lincoln is going to be, who do I have to replace George Meade with? He's kind of gone through a lot of officers, all right? And he can't go to Hooker again because the Army Potomac Officer Corps has pretty much made it clear they don't want Joe Hooker back in command. So Hooker's going to go out west and participate in fighting around Chattanooga and Atlanta in '64. So Meade is going to be in command, but Lincoln's never really going to trust Meade. And Meade's never had a good relationship with Washington because Washington insists on his operating along the Orange and Alexandria Railroad line, which he, like all Army of the Potomac commanders, do not like for the logistical and operational reasons we discussed earlier. Meade does, however, get a chance to reorganize his army for the fall campaigns. He replaces some corps commanders. Reynolds was killed at Gettysburg. So up here we got John Newton, commander of the 1st Corps. Don't worry if you've never heard him before. He doesn't really do anything much in the Civil War. 2nd Corps, commanded by Gouverneur Warren, who is going to be pretty prominent in the Army of the Potomac for the rest of its history. 3rd Corps, commanded by William Blinky French, who blinks because he drinks a lot. French's most famous up to this point is he's the one who tried to run Stonewall Jackson out of the Army. And there was a big dispute between the two of them that probably would have ended up with Stonewall Jackson court-martialed had not the job offer from VMI showed up about that same time. George Sykes, nicknamed sometimes Tardy George, because well, doesn't really do much on many battlefields. Sedgwick is still commander of the 6th Corps. Pleasanton is still commander of the cavalry. During the fall, the 11th Corps and 12th Corps are going to be sent out west after the defeat at Chickamauga to help out in the Battle of Chattanooga. Now, what Meade's going to do is he can conduct operations, again, up at Williamsport. From Williamsport, the Army marches into this valley here. They fight with Lee's forces here at Manassas Gap as Lee's army is falling back to the old area around the Rapidan and Rappahannock rivers. Meade has his army here along the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. Lee is on the defensive on the other side of the rivers. What's going to happen in October is Lee is going to try to replicate what happened in 2nd Manassas. Meade's army is down here. It's dependent on the railroads. So Lee tries to maneuver around Meade's army and cut his railroad. Meade, however, falls back and retreats back across Bull Run, which does nothing for his standing in Washington. However, during the engagement, one of his corps commanders, Gouverneur Warren, managed to set a pretty nice little ambush for A.P. Hill's corps at the Battle of Bristoe Station in October 1863. But once Meade gets in position here, Lee can't attack, so Lee retreats back across the Rappahannock River, destroying the railroad as he goes. So as Meade is advancing, he's not only got to protect the railroad, he's got to build the freaking railroad. And then his guys get here. Lee leaves 2 bridgeheads at Rappahannock Station and Kelly's Ford. Meade is going to pull off a pretty nifty night bayonet attack on both positions on November the 7th and capture both of them and capture thousands of prisoners. And he hopes he can cross over quickly and now catch Lee's army at disadvantage. But all Lee does, fall back across the Rapidan River, and Meade's got more railroad to fix and more railroad to protect. Meade is going to make an effort to try to maneuver Lee out of his line, is going to reach a position here at Mine Run, but finds Lee's forces entrenched behind Mine Run with about waist-deep water separating them from the Federals. Meade initial plans to attack the position because Gouverneur Warren on the left says he believes he found a weak point in the Confederate lines. So Meade orders an attack the next morning, December the 1st. The next morning comes. Warren sees that the Confederates have strengthened their position, and Warren, with Meade's approval, calls off the attack. Meade predicts afterwards, I will be crucified in Washington for this, for being too cautious, too careful, and you know what? If they want to relieve me, they can. And in Washington, there is huge hue and cry against Meade. You've got Dan Sickles going to Congress complaining about Meade at Gettysburg. You've got Hooker trying to lobby to command the army again. And Meade comes under incredible pressure, but nonetheless decides not to make this attack at Mine Run. And in doing so, up until this point, the Army of the Potomac had gotten a bit jaded about new commanders. You know, new commanders seemed to come and go, and they had not really warmed up to Meade. But what really happens after Mine Run, after the soldiers see that Meade exercised the moral courage not to waste their lives, it's at that point that George Meade has the Army of the Potomac with him, which is going to be one of the reasons Ulysses S. Grant really can't replace him in 1864 when he comes out from the West. What Grant is going to authorize is a plan by Meade to once again get the Army organization simplified. Meade wants to consolidate his corps into 3. Eliminate the 1st, eliminate the 3rd Corps. 3rd Corps had always been a problem because that was once Dan Sickles' corps. And when Meade goes into the campaign of 64, he's going to have 3 infantry corps. Hancock's 2nd, Warren's 5th, Sedgwick's 3rd, plus the cavalry corps, which is commanded by Phil Sheridan. And this is the force that in 1864 is going to fight from Culpeper Courthouse to the Wilderness, down to the banks of the James River, where the McClellanites had always believed the fate of the war in the East would eventually be decided. All right, I think I went way over in time as usual. and am ready, eager, able, willing to begin answering and addressing any questions you may have.